My name is Ron Brownstein. I'm a senior editor at The Atlantic, and we welcome you all to this very timely, even urgent conversation about violence in Chicago. We could be having this conversation about other cities, but certainly very relevant in Chicago. Before we get started, let me just kind of get a sense of the geography of the room. How many people here either now or ever have lived in Chicago?
Wow.
Should we do Cubs, White Sox? Cubs? White Sox? Okay. We have a great panel here. And you don't have to answer Cubs, White Sox. Corey Brooks is the pastor of New Beginnings Church, whose New Beginnings are above a skating rink, a former skating rink, and the leader of Project Hood, which is a conglomerate of community organizations working on the south side of Chicago. Liz Dozier is the founder and managing director of Chicago Beyond, a venture philanthropy that works on programs addressing challenges of Chicago youth. She is also a former principal at Fenger High School, where she was essentially featured in a documentary by CNN, My Other Hat and Life. And Tom Dart is a former state legislator and the sheriff for Cook County, and possibly the most casually dressed sheriff I have ever encountered. So if you look at the long arc of the homicide rate in Chicago, I'm going to hold up, I'm sorry I don't have them on a slide, but just hold up two slides from the University of Chicago's crime lab earlier this year. If you look at the long arc of the homicide rate in Chicago, it will tell you that the homicide rate is not quite as high now as it was at its peak in the early 1990s during the height of the crack epidemic. But it will show you that you've got a hockey stick there at the end pointing almost straight up. And if you look at the second slide from the University of Chicago, you will see that the experience of Chicago is different than the other largest cities in America, Los Angeles, New York, Houston, where they have experienced either modest increase or no increase at all in the period where Chicago has seen this spike. Why is the problem more acute in Chicago today than in our other largest cities? Sure.
You know, obviously it's complex, there's multiple factors, but some of the chief ones are the fact that our gang structure that we had like other cities as well, was very hierarchical. And there was one or two, and you could sort of predict what would happen based on shootings and retribution, all that type of stuff. We have now fractionalized to such a way where blocks have different gangs, and even though they're affiliated with, say, the Gangster Disciples, one of our biggest gangs, that doesn't mean just because you're in that gang, you're safe from another Gangster Disciple. So you have these atomization of these gangs. You add to it the fact that social media has taken on a different role here, where a slight on social media that all of us would sit there and say, oh, come on, literally starts off the shooting. And then you add to it the fact that so many of these young men, and it's mostly all young men, have access to guns. It's very easy. They have very limited opportunities in their community as far as jobs and all the rest of the things you'd expect. And then you add to it, our policing is in a state of crisis right now, and it has been for a few years now, where our closure rate for homicides is plummeted to the point now where when I talk to detainees at the jail, and I do that on a regular basis, they'll tell me all the time, it's like, well, Tom, of course I carry a gun. You would have to be nuts not to. It's so violent out there, and crossing all these different lines I have to do just to get from point A to point B. If I don't have a gun and I come across somebody, I'm dead. If I do have a gun, worst case scenario, I get picked up, no one gets convicted, everyone gets bonded out. And so you have this psychology that's building up, and then you layer into it, say, the poverty, the hopelessness, and all of that. And that's where you have this mess with absolutely no end in sight. No end in sight, and I would believe uniquely situated where it's not open to a political type of resolution, because politicians, by and large, want really quick solutions. They want one or two things, and that's not going to happen here.
I think it's this. I agree with what Tom said, but I also think it's like this notion of how the chickens have really come home to roost. That this is not just a matter of something that's happened over the last couple of years. This is something that has been boiling. When we look at disinvestment in communities, when we look at a failing educational system, when we look at like mental health centers closing down across our city over the last couple of years, that there's a culmination of things that have bubbled up in conjunction with the things that Tom is talking about that have led us to where we are at this point.
Reverend Brooks?
Well, upward of 80% of some of the households on the south side of Chicago and the west sides of Chicago in these impoverished areas are single-parent households. So one of the main factors driving a lot of the violence is that you have young individuals, young men specifically, who are growing up in homes where there's no parental influence of a father. You allow them to grow up in a system where there's no father, and then you send them off to a school that's probably not funded well. Some of the better teachers are not in those areas. And then you have them drop out somewhere around the 9th grade, and here they are on the streets, upward of 40% of them being unemployed and unemployable. They have no skills. And for those who do have skills, or for those who are trying to get skills, there's definitely a lack of opportunity. So you have all of that in one neighborhood, and then you infuse it with drugs and hopelessness, and it's a time keg just waiting to explode. And what we have in Chicago is not just the issue of gangs, which is a major issue. We're facing economic inequality. And I really do believe for our day, it's not a civil rights issue. I tell people it's a civil rights issue. And until we figure out a way to allow these individuals to get involved economically into society, they're going to continue to breed a lot of violence.
Let's go right to that. But before we do, Sheriff Dart said that he does not see this significantly improving in the near term. I wonder what you both think about that. Do you think, is this locked in for at least a while?
Well, I tend to think a little differently. I think it's time for us to have all hands on deck in Chicago. We're such a fragmented city, black, white, educated, non-educated, the haves and the haves not. It's really a tale of two cities. And you can't be a productive city when people aren't coming together. So somehow, some way, we got to figure out a way for all of us to have all hands on deck and collaborate and build consensus amongst organizations to help people. I really do believe that when we get our hands on the group that's primarily responsible for a lot of the shootings in Chicago, some have suggested that there's a group of 1,200 or 1,400 individuals who are either the shooters or going to be shot. And it seems that if the police know who these individuals are, that somehow we should try to lead them into a system that is more productive instead of just arresting them and sending them off to jail. We need to try to provide the resource. And I believe if we can do that, if we can somehow get the gangs, the gang leaders, the gangs, individuals in the gangs and start younger, I believe that we can turn the violence around. But it has to come from a grassroots movement.
Liz, what is your short-term view?
I agree too. I think that there's an element of collaboration obviously has to be there. The city is very fragmented. When I was a principal in Roseland, which is on the far south side of Chicago, I always thought that there was someone like downtown somewhere sort of like organizing and moving all these pieces together, and there was this plan in place. And what I've realized is I've taken a different seat in the city and in the philanthropic world and have been in other tables, is that that is not the case. And it feels almost like cats being herded. Everyone's sort of on their own agenda, all sort of working towards the same ideals, but no one's quite talking and connecting. I think that's critical. But I also think we have to realize that even if we hit those 1,200 or 1,400 people, like it is going to take sustained resources over time. It is not something that, regardless if you hit those 1,200 or 1,400 people, you can do that for 3 months and all of a sudden everything gets better. And I think that's missing from the conversation, this ongoing structured supports, not just with those individuals, but how are we not playing whack-a-mole and getting to the kids who are 6th, 7th, 8th grade? How are we building these continuous pipelines of supports for young people?
You're all working on really interesting interventions, and I want to get to those in one moment, but I want to go back to what you said a moment ago about the tale of two cities, because we see this in a lot of cities around the country now, where cities, again, are thriving. They are creating jobs. If you're on if you're on the north side of Chicago and you watch those condos going up, or in DC, condos going up, they didn't need those condos 15 years ago because anybody who made that much money were immediately moving out to the suburbs. But now there are a lot of jobs being created. The challenge is connecting the young people from low-income neighborhoods in the city in any meaningful way to the opportunities that the city is generating. And the question of whether you're generating a lot of jobs in Chicago for white kids from Ohio or Wisconsin, or in DC from elsewhere in the Northeast. I guess my question, Reverend Brooks, is to what, as Chicago is kind of bustling again, and there is a lot on the Riverwalk on a summer night, it is a nice place to be. How relevant does any of that seem to the kids you work with? Do they feel they can access that in any way and have it be an escalator in their own life?
The hopelessness is so embedded on the south side of Chicago in these impoverished areas that a lot of young people see themselves as detached from society, detached from the city, detached from all the wonderful things that are going on in Chicago. And just as you said, there are a lot of great buildings and construction going up around the city, but these young individuals, specifically these young black males, don't see a way in. They don't see a way into the unions to learn the trades. They don't see a way into a lot of the schools no longer teach trades, so they don't have an opportunity to go and learn construction. And that's the reason why we have to have organizations that are picking up where the schools are not able to carry on. And so they definitely don't feel attached. They definitely don't feel part of the system. And as a consequence, the hopelessness drives them deeper and deeper into the gang violence and into the violence that we see going on in Chicago.
You work with you release more people into the community, I believe, than the state system combined. Mm-hmm. What are the opportunity? Does the tailwind of a more prosperous economy in the city overall, in any way, create opportunity for them?
No, I mean, as Reverend Brooks was saying, the sense of hopelessness is so pervasive that it's very difficult for people to get their arms around it. But we as a society have to step up to the plate. I was in our legislature for 11 painful years in Illinois. And so these issues have been talked about forever. The numbers have been there forever. People know what programs work, what don't. All that's there. The difficulty is people have a difficult time stepping up to the plate and say, listen, our criminal justice system is broken, and it's been broken for decades. And how could not the population that is most impacted by that not internalize that and say, listen, they don't care. They treat us as if we don't exist. And then you look around, all the development is going elsewhere. And so you build into it not only the sense of helplessness, but there is nobody that we can trust. And so the last person I'm going to go to when I have a shooting is the police. They're not closing any of these cases. And the interaction with the police has been so bad over the years. You have all that collectively. And as you were mentioning, Ron, so we release about 30 to 40,000 people a year into the community. Well,
from the Cook County Jail?
From just my jail. Yeah. And yet most people always thought the place to go intervene was down in the prison system. But what they didn't realize is 85% of the people that get scooped up in the jail go right from the jail to the community. And we were just churning them right back out to the same 15 zip codes, mind you, that have no services, no anything. And they sit there for God knows how long. I have people waiting on their trial 9 and 10 years. And so does that build in them the sense that the society as a whole does not care? How could it not? And that's why when I was mentioning earlier, I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, because so many of these programs, and all three of us are working on ones that are really cool, really optimistic about that. But society as a whole needs to come to terms with the fact that we have overseen a criminal justice system that is absolutely broken. And that permeates every life. I mean, what would you say if you lived in one of these communities and you had one or two relatives that were picked up for little or nothing, sat in the jail for God knows how long, we dropped 20% of our cases a year, and then just had your case dropped and said, hey, go on with your life, by the way.
What is the phrase? You have people who have spent more time in the jail waiting for their trial than they are ultimately sentenced to?
Oh, God, we have over 1,000 people a year who, by the time they end up pleading guilty, have served all their time with me waiting for their case.
Sometimes plus, right?
Oh, my God. They build up an additional, I think it's 60,000 hours of time that they don't, or days, that they don't get back. They don't get that back. And so you have people sit there and say there's no connection. And then I always thought, I'm a former prosecutor too. I always thought, oh, the notion that people would plead guilty who didn't do it, that doesn't happen. Well, what would you do if your lawyer came to you and said, listen, if you plead guilty today, you walk out the door because you've sat here so long, or you can roll the dice on a trial 4 months from now, and see what happens. And if you get sentenced, you know, they give you more if you actually go to trial. People will just say, all right, well, I just want to get out of this place. And so my point is that people then see the criminal justice system as well as they should. It works well for some people, for others it doesn't, and is clearly detailed by the fact that when we have people in our jail, I cannot tell you, I have about 200 people that they need $500 to get out of my jail. $500 to get out of my jail. But a person with any amount of money would be able to walk right out the door. And so if you have money, the system sets it up in such a way where you can bail out if you want. You're not going to have a lawyer that's overwhelmed, and you're going to move along and probably get probation. If you sit there, you plead guilty.
Liz, back to my question about kind of whether the overall improved economic climate offers any opportunities here. I was with last year the vice president of a big financial firm in Chicago who told me they had hired in their current class of new employees from 125 different colleges around the country, and they basically said, look, we can get people from anywhere to come here because it is an attractive place to live again, November to April notwithstanding. But they're trying to partner. One of the things that the city has tried to do is create partnerships between employers and the community colleges. So they're working with Harold Washington Community College, and you have other health providers working with Malcolm X Community College, and all of the manufacturers with Richard Daley Community College. Do you see any kind of, and graduation rates have been rising for high school students, as you know, in Chicago, pretty significantly over the last 15 years. Is any of this making a dent? Are more people who start, young people who start in a very difficult circumstance, finding a way into the jet stream of an improving economy?
Well, I'll say two things on that. One is, yes, the graduation rates have been going up over the last number of years, which is great. But I think there's two things with that. One, what happens to those who are dropping out and not graduating, right? I mean, where are they feeding into and what is happening to them? And how are we thinking proactively and creatively about them? But two, I mean, this is 2017. This is not 1942. People need more than a high school diploma in order to see their way out of poverty, to have higher health outcomes, to be civically engaged, to be active citizens and participants. And so a high school diploma is no longer good enough. In addition, we're seeing just marginal increases in terms of college graduation for Chicago public school students. So all that matters.
Yeah, there's more. The rate of going on from high school to college has improved, but the rate of finishing, right? That's where you're saying.
Yeah.
That's where it's breaking down.
And it's also, I mean, if you look at what's happening, like 9% of low-income young people will ever wind up graduating with a college degree. Juxtapose that with 77% of their, high-income peers. And so there's great disparities there. One of the things we're trying to do at Chicago Beyond is really support programs to try to equalize that. Like one goal, to try to really make that gap. It's not even like wide. It's like it's huge.
Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
I think the statistic that jumps out at me that I remember the most is if your parents were graduated from college, you are now 5 times more likely to graduate yourself than if someone someone whose parents did not. And we think of higher education as the great escalator of upward mobility, and to some extent it has become a Xerox machine of privilege in the way that it functions. But let's talk for a few minutes. I want to talk. We want to hear about the police community relations and police reform. But before we get to that, let's talk about each of your organizations and the interventions that you are trying to deal with. What gives you the most optimism in what you are doing and what you are working? Where do you feel that you are seeing the most promise for interventions to break the cycle of lack of opportunity and expanding violence?
Well, we started an organization called Project Hood. It was started in 2012. As a result, I was on top of a roof of a motel for 94 days, bringing attention and awareness to gun violence. And I decided that I didn't want to wait on government officials to do something about it. I wanted to take the mantle by the hand and do something. So we started this organization, Project Hood. HOOD stands for Helping Others Obtain Destiny. And our focus is those individuals who are deemed undesirable, those individuals that society frowns upon, those gangbangers, those are the ones that we target. Specifically, we're trying to get them to understand that some of them have great minds, they just need another grind, and they need another opportunity. And so we're trying to transition them by starting an organization. It's a leadership and economic opportunity center. An old Walgreens building was given to us, and we've changed that building. And now there, we're trying to focus individuals on learning entrepreneurship, because I really do believe if you're going to pull people out of poverty, regardless of what education they have, they're going to have to learn some entrepreneurship if you're going to change a community. We also work on leadership, which deals with their character. We also deal with creating opportunities for yourself. For those who don't want to be entrepreneurs, we started a construction school, and even right now today, we have our first cohort of 25 people, 8 females, 17 young men who are in class learning construction, and hopefully they'll get certified and we'll help them get jobs. We also decided to start younger, not just wait on individuals to be out of high school or drop out of high school, but we have a mentoring program for 6-year-old boys all the way up to 14. And we partner with corporations and we partner with individuals who typically would not come into our neighborhood. Most of the gentlemen that mentor are from the suburbs. Most of them are not even African Americans. Most of them are white brothers who come into the city and help us mentor these boys. And so our whole program is about taking a self-assessment of an individual, finding out what they need, giving them a life plan that is specific to them, and getting them on that life plan, partnering with organizations to help them fulfill their life plan, and then setting them on a path toward reaching their destiny. And that's what we do.
Liz, tell us about Chicago Beyond. Yeah. Don't be shy.
So as a school principal for many years, I realized that there are so many good people and good programs in our city doing great work. Unfortunately, there's like a key divider there of having access to resources and tools in which to support an organization to grow. I saw it firsthand. And so Chicago Beyond started last year with the idea to be the leading grower of transformative programs and ideas and nonprofits here in the city that are working on 2 issues that we see as fundamental flip sides of the same coin. In our most marginalized communities, you cannot separate education and safety. Like those are like, they're just flip sides of the same coin, they're interlinked. And so all of our time and resources are devoted to those key issues and organizations that are supporting those issues. We've partnered with everyone from the Dovetail Project that supports young fathers and through a 12-week curriculum and helping them to be better parents and getting them on a trajectory to a productive career, all the way to one goal that I mentioned earlier that deals with college access. Last year, we supported organizations, about 7 of them, with about $15 million in resources to help really turn the tide of what they're doing. And so we're proud to take that seat in the city.
And this is an innovation challenge, right? I mean, it's a competition.
So we have some that we do just direct investments, and others we're running, which is like an innovation challenge. We're really trying to find like what are the innovative ideas out there, like who's doing something different, even if it's small. How can we help spread that idea and help it grow? So the Dovetail Project that deals with young fathers came out of that.
Is there do the progenitors of the organization, where do they come from? Do they tend to be, established institutions, religious institutions, or is it just individuals on a block? What do you find?
They're all over the place. So last year we ran our innovation challenge. We had a great organization called Story Catchers that has been around for years. It works in the juvenile detention centers and Illinois youth prisons, and just is phenomenal, getting kids, again, on a positive trajectory, to the Dovetail Project. Yeah. So they've come from really all over the place. Yeah. This year is something different. We try to really equalize the playing field. We realized that last year, when people were applying to us, a lot of them had like these fancy grant writers, and that was kind of like it wasn't necessarily fair. So this year we opened it up, and the first step is just like a video application. So just show us like what you're up to, tell us what you're up to via video.
So Sheriff, as you mentioned, you return an enormous amount of people to the community. You have some interventions now going on in the jail, I believe, aimed particularly at young men from the most violent zip codes. How are you trying to break the cycle for them?
For them, as with, frankly, most of the rest of the population we have there, I really looked at it as something where these are people in different levels that are broken. And so all around the country, the mentally ill are all been dumped into our places. And so we have programs unique for them, and then support systems in the community. For this group here, this cohort, it's 18 to 24-year-olds from 15 of the most violent zip codes within the city of Chicago. And what we do is we house them all together, which is in and of itself unique. They're in a dorm where, it's 2 dorms now because we've expanded it, where traditionally they'd be trying to hurt each other because they're from all different gangs. And we work with them on all sorts of cognitive programming, parenting classes, anger management, job-related things as well. But then we have developed relationships within the community. So in all the communities they're going back to, we hand them off to them to case manage them and work with them. And we've been doing this program now for over a year now. It's this past May was a year anniversary. And we've had almost 200 people that we've released from the program. And mind you, the people that we targeted were people on gun offenses. So these were people, under anyone's estimation, were most likely going to be shooting someone or being shot. None of them have been shot. None of them have shot anybody. And we've only had one of them come back in on a violent crime. And I'm not trying to minimize domestic violence, but it was a domestic violence case within his house and so on. So for this very young group, we've had a great deal of success. Our difficulty, though, is trying to get the partners on the outside, because in Illinois, we came across this novel idea of we don't pass budgets anymore in our state.
Yeah.
So
Interesting experiment, yeah.
yeah, it's really fascinating. It's working out really well. And so all these different community providers, amazing people, are really not excited when I come banging on their door saying, I got some people I want to hand off to you. And so we've been getting around that so far, but we can expand this greatly to this cohort. And the results have been stunning. Not only none of them have been shot or been involved with violence, but we've only had a handful of them come back in at all. And so it's a lot like what Corey was talking about, Liz was talking about. You give them a pathway. You give them, the big thing, you give them hope. You give them hope. You give them the notion that someone actually cares about them. In the system, mind you, cares about them. And then you set them on a path. Good things will happen there. It's not going to be perfect, but it's better than what every other jail and every prison around the country does, is they keep just churning them out. Keep your fingers crossed. We cut all our parole programs, we cut all that rest of the programs, and then we act puzzled why our recidivism rate is through the roof. And so, I mean, it's really using logic. It's nothing more than that. We created all this stuff ourselves, and it's doable. The difficulty is with the political world, as I know from my years on there, they're always looking for the quick fix. And so when you're telling them, like Liz was saying, this is something you got to play the long game on, they're really not that interested. And you know, they're not interested in funding programs for bad people to start with. But then when they can't sit there and cut a ribbon, they lose interest. They're like a 5-year-old. You know, their attention span's gone now. You've lost them. So you're trying to rein them in to say, listen, sustainable efforts will help restore these communities.
So, go ahead, did you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
I say a obvious big cloud hanging over all of this conversation, and part of what makes the situation in Chicago so maddening and tragic is that even as communities are dealing with this plague of violence, in many communities there's intense alienation from the policing that is supposed to protect them from the violence. Today there was an announcement of an indictment of 3 officers of obstruction of justice in the McDonald death. I just want to ask each of you, where do you think relations between the communities that you work in and the police stand at this point in Chicago?
Unfortunately, they're bad. We have a lot of young people in the city of Chicago who don't trust the police, and as a result, you see a lot of tension. We have a great police department with some great police officers. It's just unfortunate that a few of those officers have done their own thing, and as a result, it's led to a lot of damage and a lot of hurt. There have been individuals who, over the years, have been treated unfairly, and the tensions, it's hard to explain, are really, really high. Whenever you see the police in our neighborhood, I live on 66 and King Drive, the Chicago Sun-Times wrote an article 3 years ago that it's the most dangerous block in the city of Chicago. And when you see police in the area and you have individuals in the area, it causes just a very tense, a very, very tense situation.
Yeah, I agree. They're not good at all. I don't think they've been good for years. I think what's been happening lately, both nationally and locally with the police and police shootings, has it just exacerbated those tensions to like an unimaginable point. I mean, even I feel like when I get pulled over, I was never comfortable being pulled over, but even the last year or so myself being pulled over, I am even uncomfortable is not the right word. Scared is probably a better word, I think that it permeates the community. I think of one of my students who, this kid was like a straight A and B student, did all the right things, came to school like on time, great kid, never had any issues. One day I was in my office and they bring the kid into me and they said, Mr. Dozier, we have to show you something. It was one of the staff members, we have to show you something. And they laid a gun down on my desk. and it was this kid's gun. This is a straight A student, like never had any issues, comes to school on time, and obviously, you know, we had to call the police because there's a gun in the school. But when I asked him, like, I told everybody to leave my office, and I asked everyone, like, to leave. I said to him, I was like, what happened? Like, why? Like, what are you doing? You know, this is not that kid, you know. And he was like, I didn't feel safe. I didn't know how to get from my house to school and be safe. That's a failing of a whole bunch of systems, but also, like, I mean, if you knew the community in which I worked, like, there's police all up and down, like, that area, but the child didn't feel safe. And so I think there's, to say that the relations are not good is an understatement, but I still think there is hope, and I think there are things that can be done to resolve
let's
it
talk
over
about,
time.
let me just talk about kind of the state of relations, then we'll talk about some of the things that can be done.
They're not good, and they've marginally maybe gotten just a little bit better because there's been a level of scrutiny going on now. But, you know, as Liz was saying, overall, there's still this fear. And when I keep talking about systems, I was never a big systems guy until I got into this world. But you think about this element, like in our jail, if you are brought in on a gun case, you're going to 25% of the gun offenders bail out within a week. If you're charged with retail theft, only 4% get out. And the amount of money they come up with is huge. Why? The guys who are brought in on gun cases, all the gangs want to have a shooter, a guy who doesn't really care, who will shoot people. And so they'll come up with the money, substantial amounts to get them out. So then back in the community, a community where people are afraid and everybody has guns, they see these people are getting picked up on guns, they're right back in the community again. And so when I talk to detainees there, they tell me that same story. It's like, Tom, you gotta have the gun, it's so violent out there. And it's very difficult to argue with their logic there. But permeating that is the fact, though, that they don't look as the fail-safe going talking to the police. And then you add to the closure rate being so low.
Right.
They'll sit there and say, well, this homicide occurred, no one got arrested. And so it builds this thing, this lack of trust. And then the other part of it is so prevalent right now on the police side of it. I've talked to loads of police officers who said, listen, in this environment right now, if I get a call, if I drive up, if I get out of my car, I might lose my job. If I stay in my car, I'm not going to lose my job. And who's to say that I didn't see something or I did? So what it means is there's this hesitancy on the police department at times to get involved. There's, you know, Corey mentioned, most of the police are phenomenal people, and they take these, the violence is so bad, and the shootings are so bad, and they're getting shot at all the time, and they get out and get in the middle of this. But is there some of it that has, you know, been pulled back a little bit because they feel that no one's supporting them? So you have all these things coming together right now that make it so that the community as a whole, there's lack of trust and there's a lack of a feeling that the resolution is going to work the way the system's supposed to.
You know, in terms of no one supporting them, under President Obama, the city seemed to be heading toward a court-supervised consent decree to oversee its police reforms. And the Trump administration, Jeff Sessions, Attorney General, essentially is shelving the idea of consent decrees. And now the city is asking the Justice Department to appoint an independent monitor to oversee the reforms. A group of civil rights groups have sued to demand court-supervised reform. I'm just interested in your thoughts. Would an independent monitor supervising the reforms give you confidence, or would you be reluctant to say that will be enough, given the underlying reality that the Trump administration simply doesn't want to apply the kind of consent decree that seemed to be heading toward the city's way?
I think an outside monitor would be great for the sake of building trust. I think if the community is ever going to trust the police department, there's going to have to be someone from the outside to help judge things, to help monitor things. And so I believe that it would be a good thing for them to have an outside source to oversee it.
Do you think that's enough, or do you think it has to be the court in the end?
I think, well, just,
A court.
I agree with Corey, but I would add to that, I think the America that I know, if that's this series is called America, I know is not really concerned about a consent decree. They just want to be safe. And that's what, like, when you think about everyday families and people that, I mean, I interact with, they just want to be safe. And so whatever that takes, whatever that will, whether that's a consent decree, whether it's court monitored, whether that means, you know, whatever, but just that's what people are looking for.
Tom, I just got out of a 40-year consent decree.
Yes, you just come out of, right?
Yes, exactly, and that was a lot of fun.
Let's talk about that in a second. But before we get to that, You know, what feels to be happening in many cities, and Chicago is not unique, that we're facing scrutiny from the Justice Department, is that the Trump administration, in effect, and I think Chicago, it's fair to say this, is allying with the police union, who were skeptical of these kind of reforms, against the elected officials and community leaders who want these kinds of reforms. And doesn't that just widen the distance?
It does. It does. It can't help but do that, Ron. I mean, the reality of it is that, yeah, having monitors, is it painful? Does it get to be expensive? Yes. But what ends up happening at the end of the day, and I can tell you this firsthand, when you come to that sort of like, you know, fork in the road, and you have the, like in my case, a county board saying, we don't have the money for this, you have the ability to go to the monitor and the federal judge to say, you will have the money for this. And so it gets you to get the things that you need to get across the finish line, because otherwise there's a million ways to do this on the cheap that is not going to restore the confidence and actually fix things. And a lot of really good people, I think, truly believe you don't need the monitor and the consent decree and all the rest of the stuff. I can just tell you that we had so many different times where having the consent decree helped us.
You were under court supervision from 1974 until just recently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to do with myself now.
Yeah. And what are the lessons, and you said, in effect, that becomes a lever for change.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it is a backstop for those who want.
I mean, one of the big issues we had always had in jails throughout the country is what goes on in them, and use of force, and are people getting beaten. I want to put cameras everywhere. Those are really expensive. And then have people actually watching them, really expensive. I got the money to do that. If I just gone to my county board and said, and the county board, good people, but would they like jumped on board saying, we're going to spend these millions and millions of dollars to get these cameras? No, they would not have done that. And so we were able to put certain levels of supervision that was not there before, so that now when anything occurs, people know what's going on. And we have this transparency that is what people need.
I'm bringing the audience for questions in a minute, because I'm sure we have plenty. But you know, the framework from the Attorney General has been, in essence, that police reform is in tension with improving safety. I mean, what he's basically saying is we've gone too far toward demanding changes on the part of the police, and that is costing lives. That is his argument. The other point of view was expressed by the head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division under Obama, Vanita Gupta, to CNN recently. He said, it's hard to see how you can have a crime-fighting strategy that doesn't address the very serious trust issues that we found in our investigation that would lead to greater trust between residents and police. So do you view police reform as something that is kind of separate from reducing violence, or do you view it as a component of reducing violence?
I kind of view it as something separate from reducing violence. I think you have the police reforms that need to happen, but you also have things that need to happen in the community. You can fix the police all day at whatever problem you may think that they have, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have community issues. At the end of the day, you're still going to have gangs. You're still going to have guys dropping out of school at an alarming rate. You're still going to have unemployment at an alarming rate. You're still going to have the breakdown of a family. So you can have the best police department in the world, but if you still have all these social ills that are going on, no matter of police greatness is going to solve those issues. And so I think they're separate.
Liz, what about you?
I think it's a piece of the puzzle. I don't think there's any one thing you could do that would solve this. I think it's a bunch of puzzle pieces that you have to put together to make sense and to create change.
You know, you've talked a couple times about the lack of the closure rate. There's a terrific book, Ghetto-Side, about Los Angeles, the Los Angeles police.
Yeah.
And Jill Levy, a former colleague at the LA Times, you know, kind of makes the point that the lack of justice when people get killed, how I think only Chicago police identified suspects in only 29% of all homicides.
This year it's down to 14.
Wow. So what is the impact of that in a community?
How can you not lose all faith in it? And then when you start talking about the fact, think about this. So you or one of your friends in your gang has just been shot or shot at, and you don't feel that anyone's going to be brought to justice, it becomes almost second nature. It's like, we're going to handle this ourselves. So the police, as I say, my God, they're trying. But as a former prosecutor, I can tell you, you can't bring a case if you have no witnesses. And so when it permeates in their mind that there is not going to be closure here, I need to handle this myself.
Do the kids you work with, would they, if someone they knew had been shot, would they talk to the police?
No.
No. I used to have kids that would come, or parents that would come, and they would talk to me to tell me about who might have shot so-and-so, but they would never go to the police. And I think it's understandably so. I mean, when you think about not just losing one or two friends, but like losing like multiple people that you know, and somehow miraculously that is never solved. I mean, there's a lot of residual like anger and hate that resides in there. It's like almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg? So who's going to give first? Is it going to be the community that will like work with the police, or the police are going to begin to solve more crimes, make the community feel more? It's complicated.
But would you feel that as long as so few crimes are solved, isn't the cycle inexorable? I mean, it's impossible to break if people feel they have to take it upon themselves to avenge any of the crimes that have already happened.
That's the reason why it's real important for organizations, not-for-profit organizations, to get grassroots with those individuals, because until you change the mindsets of those individuals, the violence in Chicago will not change. And so it's real important that we deal with those individuals who are specifically responsible for the violence, because they're not going to tell. So there's a lot of retaliation. So it's important that we get our hands on them to redirect them in a more positive way, so that hopefully things can begin to change.
Let's go to the audience. We have lots of questions. Over here in the middle, thank you. And then if you want to line up with someone, I'll be ready for you.
So I'm a native Chicagoan with family still living in not so far from your neighborhood. And I want to know whether some of the programs that have involved former or people who have sort of been violent in the gangs, who've gotten out of it, going and talking one-on-one with current gang members, there was some national movement to use more of these kinds of programs. Does that still exist? Are they things you respect and value for possible success? And do you know of any in Chicago that are still working? I know they've been kind of controversial sometimes, but I forget the names, unfortunately, but there have even been documentaries done about them.
There's a lot of different programs that have former detainees and former convicts working. And we have a couple that are pretty successful, but it's really across the board. There's many programs that have former inmates in them. The thing that all the different programs, and this is what Liz confronts, is that historically, most all these programs, almost all, had no metrics attached to them at all. They had people who felt real strongly about their issue, but as far as actually coming there and saying, listen, recidivism rate, you name it. Even programs in the jail, when I got there, we had a boot camp. It was all the rage in the 80s. They didn't work, but they were all the rage because we made people do push-ups. And when I looked at mine, the numbers were startling. You were actually more likely to commit an offense than not. But when I asked my people, hey, what's the success rate? They always, what do you want it to be? And I was like, well, that's really not what I was looking for. But most of these programs have that. So there's a lot of former detainees, former inmates. I think it's brilliant having them engaged. Who better to connect with people?
And that's part of what Chicago Beyond is trying to do, what Tom mentioned, is to be able to give these nonprofits and people who are doing real grassroots work, to give them the data behind what they're doing so they can further develop their programs, solicit more dollars, and create sustainability.
Over here.
My name is Wayne Ducote. I'm from New Orleans. And we have a microcosm of the same problems that you have in Chicago. Currently, we have a big problem. I have two questions for you. We are operating under a consent decree that's 8 years old. I fully understand why a policeman would not get out of his car. He could get shot, he could get sued, he can lose his job. He has to fill out a form. It takes 20 minutes to 30 minutes to fill out a form if he just wants to check and see if a guy has a gun on his pocket. So the question is, do the consent decrees continue to work? Once we have, 8 years ago, we had some bad cops. It's over. How do we get rid of the consent decree with a monitor and keep the level of policing that we have? Secondly, with response to what you have, with more policemen, if I gave you a budget to double your police budget and double the number of officers on the street, would it matter? Because of the culture that we have right now, that we have to work to change over a generation or two, what will more policemen do?
Well, thoughtful consent decrees build into them the sustainability element. So it builds into all sorts of checks and balances, accountability, all that. So I believe ours will be sustainable for I don't want to say forever, but I believe close to it. The The difficulty gets to be with some of the cost involved with it, because it is very expensive to get there.
We spent $57 million so far.
Yeah, we spent more. And one of our monitors that we had is the monitor down there, and boy, they told me you have boatloads of problems down there. And so the reality is it's going to be expensive, it's going to be painful, and how the police department takes it is going to be very unique to that local jurisdiction, because the initial reaction always is to it's us against them type of thing. And so that's going to be very tricky.
I would love to hear Liz and Reverend Brooks react to the other side. Would you want to see more police on the streets in those neighborhoods?
I think, so two things on that. So I think, one, you can add more police, and I think that this is my perspective. I think that you'd see, a marginal, perhaps, decrease in some of the shootings, some of the violence. But until we get, again, to the root of the issues, which have to do with, like, education, investing in communities and, like, mental health services and, like, fatherless homes and those types of things, you're never going to see that long-term sustained change and impact. And so I think you can't police and arrest your way out of this situation.
Over here.
You've talked a lot about the police and that in Chicago, and Liz just mentioned education. So let me just talk a minute about that. I'm the chairman of the board of 20 charter high schools in Chicago, which many of you will know as the Noble High School group, and it's the largest group of charter high schools in the country. A charter high school is a public school. The students get the same amount of money that the public schools get, but it's run independently. And the chair, executive or principal of all of our schools can run it the way they want. Our results, and we're all on the south side and the west side, we're not on the north side of Chicago. Our schools have records, and education records, that so far exceed most public schools. You talk about graduation, and I think Liz mentioned 9%. I think that sounds low to me, but in any event, our graduation rate is somewhere between 37% and 45% within 6 years. These are the same students that are in all the public schools in Chicago. The difference is that there's an independence. One of the biggest differences, I'll go right to it, is the Chicago Teachers Union. Chicago Teachers Union opposes our advancing of schools, opposes our expansion, because they control the school system, and our school system is one of the worst in the country.
There's a big, broad charter school debate, but I don't know if there was a question there at the end. I'm just interested. You were in a public school, or when you were principal?
I was a principal of public school, but I've also taught and sat on the board of a charter school and it was in a private school as well.
And would you view moving a significantly larger number? I mean, is it possible to get to scale in charter schools, or can you solve the problem through charter schools, or ultimately are most kids always going to be in the public schools in your view, and those have to be?
I think ultimately we had to be talking about, like, public education as a whole, and providing every child, like, opportunity and access in the school that they reside. I think sometimes we get in this debate and we try to say, like, one versus the other, and I always think about what is happening to all of the children and how are we
So you view them as more complementary than in conflict, charters and public schools?
I think, and I'll say this about, and I again taught at all three, public, private, and then charter. What I noticed when I got to a neighborhood public school is I know that the funnel is fundamentally different. This is having been at a charter school for 4 or 5 years. In order to go to a charter school, like, there's, like, you have to fill out an application. There's steps and things you have to take. What happens to that most vulnerable child that does not have a parent or a counselor or whoever else to be able to support them in that process? And I think so by limiting and thinking about that funnel in a critical way, I mean, there are differences.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Oh, sure,
about that?
please do.
I also believe that one of the crucial things that needs to happen in the city of Chicago as it relates to education, Illinois is that we need to focus on school choice. I really do think that parents know better what school their child needs to go to, rather than the government deciding where the child needs to go. And I think tax dollars need to follow a child, whether that's the private school, charter school, or public school. And I think that competition of a person being able to take their taxpayer money and go to wherever they choose will hopefully create a better educational system.
We were talking about policing, and I was just wondering, I mean, everything that we're kind of hearing is how you're addressing the issues. And we've been doing a lot of research in North Carolina and various cities about because the leading cause of death now for African American males between 16 and 24 is actually murder. And we're seeing a lot of statistics coming out around counties actually treating that as a public health crisis, right? And just wondering if you had heard anything about around that. And if you have
we've had different fits and starts with that in our area with an organization by a guy named Dr. Gary Slunkin. Same approach, it's a public health issue. And the interrupters, they would go out into the community and try to decrease it. They've had some luck. The difficulty has been the metrics of it, because the police department traditionally has had a little bit of a tense relationship with them, where they'll say that the reason your numbers show that there's been a decrease isn't because of the interrupters and the ceasefire people that went out there. It's because we put more police resources in there. So it was both sides were just sort of, not acknowledging the other one's value. I personally, we've interacted and worked with them. We've worked with them in the jail. I don't know how it doesn't help. The difficulty is the police then want them to say, you need to give us information then. So if you hear about a shooting, you got to tell us who's involved. And that sort of undercuts the whole purpose of what they're doing, is building faith with these guys that they can come to them, that de-escalate things. So we've tried it, and I would absolutely be lying to you if I said we did it well. We didn't. But it's shown some benefits in some areas.
Before I go to the audience again, one thing that's really struck me in listening to this, you've all talked about this as a very complex puzzle with a lot of pieces. And there are also clearly a lot of different kinds of institutions responding. There's the educational system, there's the criminal justice system, there's the police, there are nonprofits. In Chicago, and we haven't really talked that much about the private sector, but there are private sector initiatives, companies that are thinking about ways to intervene. In Chicago, how well do all of these pieces work together, plan together, fit together, or is it all everyone just out rowing their own boat and you collide into each other? I mean, you've been on several sides of this, so let me start with you.
I mean, it's like I said earlier, I feel like in some ways it feels like it's hurting cats in a lot of ways. I feel like there's a lot of disconnectedness there, where there could be a lot of synergy. I think part of that is created by a few things. I think one, sometimes in the philanthropic world, we pit like nonprofit against nonprofit, and so instead of like this natural collaboration that should occur because people are competing for dollars, I think it's sometimes like it discourages collaboration. I think that's part of it. I think there are political factors that are in play here between the county and the city, and I think that creates a lot of the kind of the disconnect that we see. So I think it is complicated, but it doesn't have to be as complicated and non-collaborative. And there are, don't get me wrong, there are I think small pockets of collaboration and where people are finding synergies and doing good work. But I think by and large, if I had to say is it functioning at the tip-top level, I would say absolutely not.
Sheriff, when you talk about the challenge of how many people you release and getting them on some sort of pathway, are you able to effectively partner with nonprofit groups in the communities, or is that relatively difficult with the kind of constraints that you operate under, legal, political?
Well, it's a little tricky, but I always tell people, think about this for a second. Outside of executing someone, the second most impactful thing a society can do is to incarcerate them. When I became sheriff, our jail management system that told me who's who and the rest was a DOS-based computer system. I was lucky if I can tell you who was in the place. And so we now have a different one that allows us.
Was it kept on floppy disks?
Oh yeah, floppy disks and those
yeah.
big green pieces of paper that folded over like this. I put them out of business when I got out of that. And but the reality of it is we never took it real seriously. I mean, we being the criminal justice system, that our role is not just to churn people out. And from a sheriff's standpoint, we're only supposed to be holding people for a short period of time before trial. So it discourages sheriffs all around the country from planning and from looking into it. And so for us, we've spent all this money on technology and bringing young people in from the universities to work with us to find out, A, what caused them to come in, B, what do we have in front of us, and C, where can we send them out there? Our big problem, though, then, is the different partners out there. They want to, but they're even before we got so dysfunctional in Illinois, they weren't really well funded to start with, but they don't have the capacity to do it, which speaks volumes about our society.
So what is your capacity to coordinate and magnify your efforts working with other nonprofits, or for that matter, the police and the public schools? How are you able to kind of row together?
Yeah, we really believe in collaboration, and I'm glad that the sheriff is here because we can take all of his individuals who are coming out who live in the Woodline, Inglewood, just send them right over to us. We'll take all of them,
in about an hour.
and we'll take every single one of them, and we do it, and I'm grateful We do it without government funding. We have not received government grants. We don't take government grants, nor do I want a government grant to run our programs, because I really do believe that breeds a lot of the competition between a lot of the non-for-profits. They're always trying to get the grant. They're always trying to get the finances to stay afloat. And with it, when that happens, it causes some animosity. And so we've decided we're not going to take government grants so that we can collaborate with other organizations, and so they don't see us as a threat to their financial portfolio, but they see us as a partner who really wants to do something to enhance the neighborhood. And so that's how we go about it.
We're down to our last couple of minutes. I'm just interested, you've all talked about and understandably, about kind of the magnitude of this challenge and not to expect instant solutions. But what do you think are reasonable near-term goals for your community, for the city? What should people in Chicago hold their leaders accountable for achieving over the next 2 or 3 years?
We'll start with you.
That was pretty cool, the way it just went right down the...
Exactly.
I don't know if there's anybody over you can turn to anybody in the audience and ask them.
Yeah, I think that the people within the city of Chicago have to hold all of the elected people's feet to the fire. Because I'll just be honest with you, I'd love to give you this statement that all of the different elected people care. They don't. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, the reality is most of these issues are well known. They've been around for a while. But the amount of people actively engaged with it are not a lot. So we have to start by holding the elected people accountable by saying, listen, we're going to set what are modest goals, which are going to see decrease in shootings, decrease in homicides there. So let's start with that. And then we're going to have a protracted reinvestment in these communities so that I have places I can hand people off to more readily. So that we look at it as that I always tell people, in my jail, probably, I don't know, 30%, 20%, take your pick, are evil. Don't know how they got there, but they're evil people. The 70, the biggest percent, we can work with them. We can fix them. They're people who've made mistakes. Made mistakes that, frankly, if I made the same mistake, I would have had someone bond me out. I probably might not have even been arrested in the first place. But so this larger group, we can fix them with just thoughtful plans that have metrics attached to them, like what Liz is doing, that have the handoff. So I work with them inside. We hand them off to someone who stays connected to them. So this is all really doable things, and the public has to hold this, starting with the numbers of the homicides and the shootings, so that there's some faith it's going in the right directions and change people's mentalities.
Unless you want to add something, I think that's do you want to add a thought about?
I would just, only thing I would add on to that, I agree with like the decrease in shootings and homicides and those things, but I also think we have to hold our leaders accountable for investing in our educational system. And I've said this about 4 times on this panel, but I think it's absolutely critical for most of our young people. That is the only pathway out for them to have a more productive life. I think that's important as well.
You get the last word.
Okay. I think investment into the community, giving people an opportunity regardless of what color they are, regardless of whether they live on the south side, north side, or west side of Chicago. Until we give an opportunity to everyone, then we're going to continue to see the violence, and we need to make sure that we hold all of our elected officials, just making them be more accountable. I always tell our church, people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. And so we need to continually inspect our leaders and make sure that they're following through on what they said they're going to do.
Well, there's a lot of dark clouds in this subject, but I think all of you have kind of lit a candle here today. So you join me in thanking Corey Brooks, Liz Dozier, and Tom Dart, and thank you.